It was the moment when they stepped off the ship, their tired eyes squinting in the unfamiliar sunlight. The air was thick with humidity, not the sharp, bitter cold of Europe they were used to, but something entirely different. The sound of waves lapping against the docks mixed with the distant hum of bustling American life. Margaret Miller, a nurse by profession, had never imagined that this would be the beginning of something so unexpected. She and her fellow German POWs had been prepared for nothing but cruelty in America. But instead, they found themselves staring at a completely different world, one they had only heard about in propaganda, a place that was supposed to be a land of savagery and terror. As they were herded off the ship, Margaret couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. She had heard the stories. The brutal treatment. The harsh, unforgiving soldiers. The rumors of American hatred for prisoners. And yet, as she stepped onto American soil, the only thing she could feel was the sheer normalcy of it all. The dock, though crowded with workers, had none of the grim tension she expected. The men and women working there seemed indifferent to their arrival, almost disinterested. Margaret looked around, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The tall buildings, the neat rows of ships, the faces of people who barely spared a glance at her. Everything was calm. Everything was so ordinary. This was not the America they had been taught to fear. As they were marched to a nearby truck, the guards, who were American soldiers, spoke to each other in a language that sounded so strange. Margaret caught a few words here and there, but nothing that felt threatening. They passed through a line of soldiers who didn't look at her with contempt, but with what seemed like curiosity. "You will be treated fairly," one of the guards said to them, his voice calm, matter-of-fact. Margaret's mind raced. Fairly? She had heard the opposite. Her thoughts were interrupted as the truck started moving, taking them deeper into the American heartland. The countryside was nothing like she had imagined. The fields stretched endlessly, greener than she had ever seen, dotted with small houses that looked peaceful, almost like something from a painting. There were no destroyed buildings, no signs of war. The devastation she had expected to see in America, the aftermath of battle, was absent. Instead, everything appeared so pristine. It was almost like a dream. She couldn't understand how it was possible. The train ride had been long, filled with uncertainty and fear, but now, with each passing mile, her anxiety seemed to melt away. The train slowed as it approached a small town. The sign read, "Welcome to Colby, Kansas." Margaret watched as the locals walked along the streets, going about their business with no care in the world. She could hear the sound of children playing in the distance, their laughter floating on the air. She hadn't heard such a sound in years. And then, the unthinkable happened. A woman, no older than Margaret, stepped up to the train with a basket in hand. "Here, take some bread," she said, handing it to one of the women next to Margaret. The women froze, unsure of what to do. Bread? From an American? They had been prepared for hostility, for violence, but nothing had prepared them for this simple act of kindness. It was like a slap in the face, a reality check that shattered everything they had been taught to believe. "It's safe," the woman said with a smile, her accent thick but friendly. "Eat." Margaret stared at the bread in her hand. It was soft, warm, and unlike anything she had tasted in years. Slowly, cautiously, she took a bite. It was real. The taste was rich, comforting. Her body, starved for months, craved it. And with each chew, the weight of her fear seemed to lessen. She was still unsure, still haunted by the stories, but for the first time since her capture, Margaret felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as bad as she had imagined. The next morning, as the truck rolled into the small town of Colby, Kansas, Margaret could barely believe her eyes. She had been expecting a scene of despair, a town ravaged by war, perhaps even worse than the devastation she had seen in Europe. But instead, the landscape was dotted with neat houses and fields, stretching as far as the eye could see. It looked like something from a dream, nothing like the war-torn streets she had left behind in Germany. The air was thick with the scent of fresh grass and earth, and the sound of birds chirping in the trees was a stark contrast to the gunfire and bomb blasts she had become accustomed to. The truck stopped in front of a large, white farmhouse. A man in his 50s, dressed in worn denim and a plaid shirt, stepped out onto the porch. His face was weathered but kind, and his eyes met Margaret's with a calmness she had not expected. "Welcome to Colby," he said simply, his voice steady but warm. He gestured for them to get down from the truck. The POWs slowly made their way to the ground, unsure of what to do next. Margaret's legs were stiff from the long journey, and she stumbled slightly, but the man quickly reached out to steady her. "You must be tired," he said, guiding her to the porch. "Come on inside. We have food." Margaret hesitated for a moment, the weight of her fear still heavy in her chest. But something in the man's voice, something in the way he spoke, made her feel a flicker of trust. She nodded, following him inside. The kitchen was warm, filled with the aroma of fresh baked bread and sizzling bacon. The sight of it took Margaret by surprise. She had not seen food like this in months, real food, the kind that made her stomach growl in a way she had almost forgotten. The woman at the stove, presumably the man's wife, smiled at them as she worked. "Don't be shy," she said, motioning for them to sit at the table. "It's not much, but it's a lot better than what you've been used to." Margaret sat down slowly, still trying to process what was happening. Her mind raced with thoughts of everything she had heard about America, stories of brutality, of harsh treatment, of endless suffering for prisoners. But here, in this quiet kitchen, none of that seemed to be true. The bread was soft and warm, the butter rich and creamy. Margaret took a bite, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than fear and hunger. She looked up at the woman across from her, who was now serving them. "Coffee." "Thank you," Margaret said softly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. The woman smiled warmly, her eyes kind. "It's nothing. You need food to work, don't you? We'll take care of you while you're here." The simplicity of the kindness took Margaret off guard. She had expected to be treated with suspicion, to be kept at arm's length, but instead, these people, who had no reason to be kind to her, were treating her as though she were just another guest. As the meal went on, Margaret began to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more of a confusion. How could this be happening? How could these strangers be so generous when her own country had painted the Americans as monsters? But as the conversation flowed, as they shared stories of their lives and laughed together, that confusion slowly began to fade. She had been wrong about them, and perhaps she had been wrong about America as a whole. After the meal, the man led Margaret and the others outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. He pointed to a large barn in the distance. "That's where you'll be working," he said. "It's hard work, but we could use the help." Margaret nodded, her body still aching from the journey, but the promise of work, real work, not the forced labor she had known, sounded like a small bit of freedom. As they walked toward the barn, Margaret couldn't help but notice the beauty of the land, the wide open spaces that stretched out before her like a world untouched by war. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of possibility. Perhaps this wasn't the America she had been warned about. Perhaps it was something different altogether. The next few days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Margaret and the others adjusted to their new lives in the small town of Colby. The work was hard but simple, tending to the fields, feeding the animals, and helping around the barn. The farmer, John Carter, was always kind but firm, teaching them how to work the land as if they had done it their entire lives. Margaret had never seen a field of wheat so vast, nor had she ever been so close to animals like the cows and horses that roamed the farm. Every day, she worked beside the other women, and with each passing hour, she felt the weight of her old fears slowly lift. They worked in silence at first, each woman lost in her thoughts, unsure of what to say to the Americans who watched them. But as the days stretched on, the silence began to fade. Slowly, they learned bits of English, enough to understand the basics. One afternoon, as Margaret was leading a group of cows into the barn, John Carter came up beside her. "You're getting the hang of it," he said with a smile. Margaret nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. The heat in Kansas was something she had never experienced before, the air so thick it felt like breathing through a blanket. But she was starting to get used to it. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but genuine. John just nodded and walked off to check on the crops. It was a simple interaction, but for Margaret, it felt like a small victory. She was no longer just a prisoner of war. She was becoming part of something, even if it was just a small part of a vast American farm. As the days passed, the town began to feel more like home. Margaret and the other women were treated with kindness, though they were still regarded with suspicion by some of the townsfolk. But no one openly mistreated them, and that was more than Margaret had ever expected. One evening, as the sun was setting over the fields, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with John and his wife, Sarah. The three of them were drinking iced tea, the cool sweetness of it a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Margaret sipped her drink slowly, trying to absorb everything she had learned in the past week. The landscape, the people, the quiet rhythms of American life, it was all so different from the world she had known. "You've made a lot of progress," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Margaret looked at her, surprised. "You really think so?" she asked. Sarah smiled, nodding. "Of course. You're learning fast." Margaret looked down at her hands, rough and calloused from the work. "It's not much, but it's something." Sarah laughed softly, the sound light and easy. "It's more than something," she said. "You're becoming a part of this farm, of this community. It may not be the life you expected, but it's a good one." Margaret looked out across the fields, her thoughts drifting. A part of her still longed for her old life, for the familiar streets of Germany, for the friends she had lost in the war. But another part of her, a part she hadn't expected to find, was starting to feel something else, something like peace. She had never thought she would feel that again, not after everything she had been through. But here, in this quiet corner of America, Margaret was beginning to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret took a deep breath. The air smelled of freshly cut hay and earth, a smell so simple and pure that it made her heart ache. For the first time since her capture, she felt like she could breathe again. Maybe, just maybe, this place, this America, was not the land of monsters she had been taught to fear. It was a place where kindness could grow, even in the most unexpected of places. Weeks passed, and Margaret's life on the farm became a routine she never expected to find comfort in. The hard work was still there, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and learning the rhythms of the land, but something had changed. The dread that once gripped her heart whenever she thought about America had faded. The farm, the people, the small town of Colby, it was not the land of nightmares she had imagined, but a place where kindness had begun to grow roots in her soul. She had never been one to believe in second chances, especially after everything she had been through. But in the quiet mornings when she worked alongside Sarah in the garden, or in the evenings when she and John sat on the porch watching the sunset, she began to feel something new, a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One crisp fall day, as Margaret was feeding the horses in the stable, she noticed a group of American soldiers passing by on horseback. She had seen soldiers before, of course, but this time, something was different. As they approached, one of the soldiers, a young man with a friendly smile, waved at her. "How's the farm treatin' ya?" he called out. Margaret was taken aback for a moment. She had gotten so used to being invisible, to being the prisoner, that this simple greeting felt like a shock to her system. She waved back, unsure of how to respond. "It's good," she said, her voice hesitant. "Good work, good people." The soldier smiled and rode on, leaving Margaret standing there, staring after them. The encounter stayed with her for the rest of the day, and as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't help but think about the kindness in his eyes. It was strange to her now, how people could be so open, so kind, to someone like her, someone who had been on the other side of so much hate and suspicion. In Germany, she had been taught to view Americans as nothing but enemies, monsters in uniforms. But here, in the heart of America, it seemed like the only monsters were the ones that existed in her mind, the ones that had been fed to her by years of propaganda. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret found herself starting to smile more often, something she hadn't done in years. She was learning to trust again, to believe in the goodness of others. One evening, as she was walking through the fields, John caught up with her. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice low and steady. "Everything okay?" Margaret looked at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. "I think I'm starting to understand," she said softly. John raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" She paused, searching for the right words. "What it means to be free." John's expression softened, and he gave her a small nod. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "But you know you don't have to do this alone. You've got a place here, Margaret. A home." Margaret blinked, fighting the sudden rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. A home. The word felt foreign, almost too big to comprehend. For so long, home had been a distant memory, a place she had lost forever. But now, here in this quiet, sun-drenched corner of Kansas, it was starting to feel like it could be something more. Maybe it was possible to start over, to build something new from the ashes of the past. As she walked back to the farmhouse, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields, Margaret realized that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like she had found something worth holding on to. Months had passed, and Margaret had grown more comfortable with the rhythm of life on the farm. The land had begun to feel familiar, like an old friend she hadn't known she had. The early mornings spent with the animals, the long afternoons in the fields, and the quiet evenings by the fire were no longer just tasks, they had become moments of peace. One crisp morning, as Margaret walked out to feed the cows, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, flowers blooming along the edges of the fields. She paused, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of wonder. The colors were bright, vibrant, a stark contrast to the muted, gray world she had left behind in Germany. It was a simple sight, but in that moment, it symbolized everything that had changed in her life. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The world around her was blooming, too. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Sarah walking toward her, a basket of freshly baked bread in her hands. "I thought you might like some breakfast," Sarah said, offering the basket with a smile. Margaret smiled back, grateful for the kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. As they sat together, eating and talking about nothing in particular, Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the bread, it was the connection, the comfort of having someone to share a quiet morning with. It was something she hadn't realized she'd been missing for so long. As the weeks continued to pass, Margaret's bond with Sarah and John deepened. They were no longer just the farmers who had taken her in. They had become something more, friends, even family. There was no rushing the healing process, no magical moment when everything fell into place. It had happened slowly, piece by piece, as Margaret's walls came down one by one. She began to open up more, to share more of herself with them. She told them about her life in Germany before the war, about her family, about the dreams she had once had. In return, Sarah and John shared stories of their lives, their families, and the struggles they had faced on the farm. The connection was simple but profound. One evening, as Margaret and John sat outside on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he spoke quietly. "You've done more than just work here," he said. "You've made this place feel like a home." Margaret looked at him, her heart full. "I never thought I'd have a home again," she said. John smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "Everyone deserves a place to belong." As the seasons changed, so did Margaret. She had begun to feel like part of something bigger than herself, something that had been built on kindness, hard work, and trust. It was no longer just a farm. It was a place where she had found a new sense of purpose, a place where she could rebuild her life, not from the ashes of the past, but from the seeds of hope and possibility. The days were still long and the work was still hard, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had a place in this world made it all worthwhile. Margaret had come a long way from the woman who had stepped off the ship all those months ago, unsure of what the future would hold. Now, as she walked through the fields, the flowers blooming around her, she realized that the future was hers to shape, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace it. It was a bright spring day when Margaret felt it, a small but undeniable shift inside her, like a weight lifting from her chest. The farm had become her life, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. She had found a rhythm here, not just in the work, but in the people around her. John and Sarah had become more than just the farmers who had taken her in. They had become family, in every sense of the word. The warmth of the sun on her face as she worked the fields was no longer a reminder of the hardships of war, but a sign of new beginnings. Margaret had found peace in the quiet, steady life of farming, and she had found joy in the small, everyday moments, sharing a meal with Sarah, working alongside John, laughing at the simple, sometimes silly things that life on a farm brought. The sense of home she had longed for was no longer a distant memory, it was here, in this place, with these people. The change hadn't come all at once. It had been gradual, like the slow growth of the crops in the fields. Margaret had learned to take each day as it came, finding fulfillment in the work, in the sense of purpose it gave her. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a good life. She had a place here, and she was making it her own. One afternoon, as Margaret sat on the porch after a long day of work, she watched the sun begin to set, casting a golden glow over the fields. She felt a sense of contentment that she had never thought possible. She had come so far since the days when she had arrived at the farm, unsure of what to expect, uncertain of her place in the world. The woman who had stepped off the ship all those months ago was no longer the same person. She had learned to trust again, to embrace the possibility of a future she had once thought was beyond her reach. "You've done well here," John said as he walked up to the porch, his voice quiet but full of meaning. Margaret smiled at him, grateful for his words. "I've learned a lot," she replied. "Not just about the land, but about myself." John nodded, his gaze softening. "You've found your place," he said simply. Margaret looked out at the horizon, the field stretching out before her, the sky painted with the colors of the setting sun. For the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to create a new life. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been without its challenges, but it had been worth it. The road to healing had been long, but she had made it. And as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the farm, Margaret knew that she had found something precious, a place to call home. It was a cool autumn evening when Margaret found herself walking along the edge of the fields, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows across the ground. She had grown used to these moments of quiet reflection, the slow rhythm of life on the farm allowing her mind to wander. But today, something was different. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken tension that had settled over the farm. As she walked, she could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, and when she turned, she saw John approaching, his face serious. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. John stopped in front of her, taking a deep breath before speaking. "There's something we need to talk about," he said quietly. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, trying to read his expression. John hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching the horizon before meeting her gaze. "There's been word that the war might not be over for everyone. The government is starting to talk about bringing people back." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning, and everything she had built here, on this farm, felt like it might slip through her fingers. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John looked at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "There's a chance they might send you back, Margaret. To Germany." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything she had feared. The life she had built here, the peace she had found in the quiet of the farm, suddenly seemed fragile, like a dream that might shatter at any moment. Margaret took a step back, her heart racing as the thought of leaving this place, of returning to a past she had worked so hard to escape, gripped her. "I can't go back," she said, the words escaping her before she could stop them. John reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know," he said softly. "I just wanted to prepare you, in case it happens." Margaret stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling deep within her. She had spent so long fighting for survival, for the chance to build something new, and now the prospect of losing it all felt unbearable. But as she looked out at the fields, at the land that had become her refuge, she realized something. She wasn't the same person who had stepped off that ship months ago. She had fought her way to this place, and no matter what the future held, she wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know how, but I'm not going back to that life. Not after everything I've found here." John gave her a small smile, the kind that spoke volumes, as if he understood. "Then we'll fight for it together," he said. Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle in her chest. She didn't know what would come next, or how things would turn out. But one thing was certain, she had found a place where she belonged, and she wasn't going to let anything take that from her. The days following John's revelation were a blur of uncertainty for Margaret. Every time she stepped out into the fields, the weight of the news hung over her like a storm cloud. She couldn't escape the thought of being sent back to Germany, to a life she had tried so desperately to leave behind. The farm, the people, the peace she had found, it all felt so fragile now, like a dream she was afraid might vanish. But as the days passed, something began to shift within her. She refused to let the fear take hold. She had worked too hard to rebuild her life, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. One morning, as Margaret was tending to the animals, Sarah came to find her, a letter in her hands. "This just arrived for you," she said, her voice hesitant. Margaret took the letter, recognizing the seal on the envelope immediately. It was from the government. Her heart skipped a beat. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling as she read the words. The letter informed her that the government had decided to extend her stay in America, allowing her to remain on the farm. The news hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't over. She wasn't being sent back. Tears filled her eyes as the weight of the moment settled in. She had been given the chance to stay, to continue building the life she had started here. The life she had fought for. Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with understanding as she watched Margaret's reaction. "You're staying," she said, her voice warm. Margaret nodded, still trying to process the relief that washed over her. "I'm staying." It was the first time in months that she truly felt the full weight of that word. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The following days were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret threw herself into her work with a vigor she hadn't felt before, determined to make the most of the second chance she had been given. The farm had become her home, and she was no longer just a guest here. She was a part of it, a part of this land and the people who had shown her so much kindness. As the weeks passed, Margaret's bond with John and Sarah grew even stronger. They had become more than just her caretakers. They had become her family, and she had finally found a place where she belonged. She no longer thought about the past, about the life she had lost. She thought about the future, the life she was creating here. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, John looked at her with a smile. "You've done good, Margaret," he said. "You've built something here." Margaret returned his smile, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. "You and Sarah." John nodded, his expression softening. "We all do our part." And in that moment, Margaret realized just how far she had come. She had found a place of peace, a place of hope, and most importantly, a place of belonging. It had been a long journey, but she had made it. She had found her home. As the seasons continued to shift, Margaret's life on the farm settled into a rhythm that felt more and more like home with each passing day. The initial uncertainty had faded, replaced by the kind of comfort that only time could bring. The farm was alive with the bustle of spring planting and the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. Margaret had grown into the role she had once feared, not just as a worker, but as a member of the family. One afternoon, after finishing a long stretch of work in the fields, Margaret stood at the edge of the land, looking out over the vast stretches of farmland that now felt like her own. The soft breeze tugged at her hair, and she breathed in deeply, savoring the scent of freshly turned earth. For the first time, she realized how much she had grown, how much she had changed. She was no longer the woman who had arrived on this land, unsure of her future and burdened with the scars of war. She was someone new now, stronger, more certain of herself, and deeply connected to this place. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her, and she turned to see John walking toward her, his familiar smile making her heart feel warm. "You've been working hard today," he said, his tone light. Margaret smiled back, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I like it that way. Keeps my mind clear." John nodded and glanced out at the land. "It's a good place to be," he said softly. "And you've made it even better." Margaret's smile faded a little as she looked out across the fields. The quiet peace of the moment, the work, the routine, it was all hers now. But there was something she hadn't shared with John, something that had been growing inside her since she had received the letter from the government months ago. She had found a sense of belonging here, but she knew that the future was still uncertain. The thought of being sent away, of leaving the life she had built, still haunted her occasionally. But every time it crept into her thoughts, she reminded herself of what she had already overcome. She wasn't the same person who had stepped off that ship. She was different now, stronger, and no matter what came next, she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her through the hardest days. "John, I've been thinking," Margaret said, her voice quieter now. "I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know that I've found something here. Something worth fighting for." John turned to face her, his expression softening as he understood what she was saying. "You found more than that," he replied. "You found a home." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the word settle in her chest. A home. She hadn't realized how badly she had needed that word, how badly she had needed a place to belong. As she looked at the land before her, at the people she had come to love, Margaret felt a sense of peace, not because everything was certain, but because she knew she was no longer alone in the world. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt ready to face whatever came next. She had a family now, a home, and most importantly, she had herself, a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up, stronger than she had ever been before.